Hello, everyone. My name is Carl Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. It says we're on panel 1 Q&A, but we're actually now on panel 2, that we're going to talk about two very important human rights issues in China. That's China's political prisoners and its mistreatment of minorities. Today, we're going to start off. We have three amazing speakers with profound experience, with a lot to share with us from individual perspectives. The first is Nury Turkel. Nury is a commissioner of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He's also the founder of the Uighur Human Rights Project. He will be followed by Naomi Kikoler. Naomi is a director of the Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And she will be followed later by Sheng Xue, an award-winning poet, journalist, writer, and human rights activist, who is also currently the vice chairperson of the Federation for a Democratic China. The issues we're talking about today are not theoretical, they are real, they're in the media. If anyone looked today, for example, Deutsche Welle, the German public broadcaster, had a detailed expose on Uyghurs in Xinjiang, China, being forced to pick a crime off a balance sheet and then just thrown in jail with no time in front of a court or whatever. This is a serious issue that's ongoing. And we also have political prisoners who are speaking up, either citizen journalists or medical doctors or democracy activists. So we aim to have an extremely interesting discussion. Before we start, I would just like to make the statement that my institute has been working on these issues for a few years now. Last year, we hosted Dolkan Issa, the leader of the World Uighur Congress, and we had the Chinese Consul General to Montreal try to shut down our event. He put pressure on the mayor of Montreal to shut down a university-based event. So tying to the issues of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, as Chris mentioned in the first panel, there are cases where universities are coming under enormous pressure and we must push back. So first, each of our speakers have been invited to give a 5 to 7 minute presentation. We will then follow with a discussion among all the panelists, and then we'll turn to the audience on social media for detailed questions. So I'd like to ask Nury, the floor is all yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Kyle, for that introduction. I wanted to thank the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights for inviting the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom for USERF to participate in this important event. It is truly an honor to join you all, especially in my new capacity as a USERF commissioner. For many of us who work on human rights promotion as government officials, Raoul Wallenberg is something of patron saint. As I'm sure many of you know, Wallenberg served as a Swedish diplomat in Budapest during World War II, when Hungary was occupied by the Nazis. Rather than standing by, he used his authority to issue protective passports to European Jews. He also sheltered Jews in the buildings designated as Swedish territory. Historians estimated that he saved tens of thousands of men and women and children from what later come to known as the Holocaust. Unfortunately, Wallenberg himself disappeared after the Soviet occupation of Budapest. However, his legacy lives on. The Representative Tom Lantos, a longtime champion of human rights in the US Congress, was one of those young Jews saved by Wallenberg. Lantos played an important role in creating USERF through the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. He was an important partner in our work before his unfortunate passing in 2008. So in a sense, USERF might not exist but for Raoul Wallenberg's bravery. USERF was created to address exactly the type of religious freedom abuses that Wallenberg challenged and that Representative Lantos endured. We are an independent government commission created by Congress in order to elevate and promote religious freedom around the world. We do this by monitoring and reporting on religious freedom conditions in dozens of countries, including China, and by making policy recommendations to the White House, State Department, and Congress. Our commission has been warning about religious freedom violations in China from the very beginning. In our very first annual report, published in 1999, we condemned the Chinese government's crackdown on independent religious groups. Even at that time, USERF warned the US government not to ignore human rights and freedom of religion in China. As the earlier panel have noted, the situation has only worsened, gotten worse since then. Millions of Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps. An Orwellian surveillance state has been built and managed. Organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners are still in practice. Nighttime rape against house churches is still being practiced by the Chinese government. Expelling thousands of Tibetan monks and nuns from their monasteries are still happening as we speak. The scale of China's repression would be unfathomable if I did not know so many people personally affected by it. Sometimes while reading about these developments, I find myself wondering if there are any Wallenbergs in China quietly working to mitigate the repression. I'm sure many of you saw the report by the New York Times last November about the leaked Chinese government documents from the Uyghur region. The report described the chilling details how Chinese government created the largest concentration camp network in the world since World War II. That report was only possible because the Chinese government official leaked more than 400 pages of official documents to journalists. This unnamed official risked his or her life and liberty in order to ensure that Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders would not escape responsibility for their crimes. The leaked documents discuss another Chinese official, Wang Yongzhi, a former Chinese Communist Party boss of Yerkang County as part of the Kashgar Prefecture. Mr. Wang initially went along with the government's crackdown of Uyghurs. At some point, however, he had a change of heart and released 7,000 internees from the camps in his jurisdiction. Mr. Wang warned his superior that the government's ruthless assault on Uyghur Muslims did not reflect the realities on the ground. He also reportedly told the party officials that there was nothing wrong with having Quran at home. He even encouraged them to read it in order to better understand the Uyghur culture. Rather than heed his advice, Chinese government, Communist Party, stripped him of power and persecuted him. Nor is Mr. Wang alone. The Times reported that thousands of government officials in Xinjiang were punished for resisting or failing to carry out the crackdown, quote unquote, sufficient zeal. What can the United States do to encourage any remaining Wallenberg or Wang Yongzhi in the Uyghur region to act on the better angel of their nature? One approach would be to impose financial sanction and visa bans under the Global Magnitsky Act against those Chinese officials responsible for the mass internment of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in the region. Fortunately, the Uighur Human Rights Act, which Congress passed last month, directs the administration to do just that. I urge President Trump, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, to put two names on top of that list. First, Chen Quanguo, the current Communist Party Secretary in Xinjiang and former Secretary of Tibet. The second, Zhu Hailun, the former Xinjiang Political and Legal Affairs Commission chief, who happened to be the key architect of the concentration camp system. Doing so will send a message to the anonymous leakers and other Wang Yongzhis in the Chinese bureaucratic system, who would be willing to risk their lives and who will not be doing so in vain. The world will hold these responsible for those crimes accountable. In addition, it's incredibly important that we try to document the actions of lower-level Chinese officials. We need to keep track of those who committed abuses and who resist. The State Department's Office of Global Justice, Criminal Justice, and the Holocaust Memorial Museum are well positioned to act as research hubs for this effort. Perhaps one day this information will be used in trials to hold those responsible for these crimes against humanity accountable. History will remember who stayed silent, who took a stand against the Communist Party's war on faith. We have to make concrete progress during the past few years, but that is not enough. it will take many more years of long, hard work to see justice for the Uyghur people, Tibetan Buddhists, Christians, and Falun Gong practitioners in China. As we do so, we should never forget the example of Raoul Wallenberg, who provided that one person can make a difference. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Nury. That was a powerful presentation, and I'm glad you mentioned Wallenberg. Talk about the power of individuals to make a difference, and I was really left feeling your comment. Are there any Wallenbergs in China? And I'm sure there are. No doubt there have to be. I would like now to ask Naomi Kikoler of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum to take the floor.
Thank you so much, Kyle, and thank you for all of the organizers for today's incredibly important conversation. And it's a real honor to be here and to join my fellow panelists in the conversation. As an institution, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum seeks to do for communities today what was not done for Jews during the Holocaust. And in the course of the work that we do, one of the hard lessons that we grapple with is that often the resolve of those who are intent on perpetrating crimes is often far greater than those who seek to stop them. And I think that when we're looking at the reality of mass atrocities that are being committed by the Chinese government, that is very true. And it's one of the really challenging aspects of trying to determine what a course of action is for responding. I think for us, we start from the premise of trying to acknowledge and give voice to the survivors, to Nury and others who are living the reality and the consequences of what we believe are crimes against humanity that are being perpetrated by the Chinese government against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. And to those who at great risk to themselves and their families are choosing to speak out. And very much appreciate the emphasis that Nury put on the heroic people within China, within the Chinese government, who recognize that what is happening is not right. Part of the important lessons that we have found from the Holocaust and through the physical space of the museum and our online exhibits, which thankfully you can still access right now, try to share, is that it is so often the individual leadership of key people who are able to help change the course of action, but usually only when in conjunction with allies and partners elsewhere that are working to help put a spotlight and elevating not just the attention, but also changing the incentives for the actors who are perpetrating the crimes. And that's where I think right now a lot of our energy and focus has to be looking at how, in addition to the tools that Nury mentioned, can we be doing that for the Uyghur community and for others. One of the great challenges we of course face is the access to information. And often that is expressed as something that is inhibits our ability to act. I think we need to interrogate that, and I think the first panel and even Nury kind of spoke to this, and it's been documented. There is actually a lot of information about what is happening to the Uyghur community and to others. It's remarkable when you think of what is available from those who have left and who've able to share their stories once in exile. It's also remarkable when you look at what the Chinese government itself has said, and when they have explained the rationale for, as Kyle said, the detention of people without cause, where there is references to some form of a justification. It's quite clear that that reinforces a narrative around what we argue could be persecution. I think one of the things that's really important to acknowledge when we talk about this, and maybe just to kind of give the sense of perspective, is that we are looking at the mass detention of a people, not just on the basis of their religion, as Nury said, but also their ethnic identity. And that when we think even about kind of where MIGS is based in Montreal, you know, if one was to really take a step back and imagine that we're talking about the entirety of the population of Montreal that is either in some form of detention or extreme surveillance, it has been in detention at some stage. That's how stark the challenges and the situation is. Yet, if it was any other country that was committing crimes on this scale, this would be the issue that would be before the Security Council on a regular basis, before the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly. We would be seeing not just every now and then news articles, and I really commend the journalists that have been covering it, but really I believe this would garner far more attention than it has. One of the reasons that we feel it's so important to talk about crimes and to actually invoke the language of crimes against humanity is because we believe that there are corresponding responsibilities, not just for the government of China, but also for the international community to respond, and that those are stemming from the fact that we believe that there is widespread and systematic crimes against humanity that are being committed against this particular community. One of the efforts that we're trying to undertake is to continue to advance that legal analysis and make that available, as Nury said, to help form the basis for future engagement by not just the Uighur and Turkic community, but also from the broader international community. We know that perpetrators often use and try to find some sort of rationale for their crimes. Another aspect of our work is trying to examine and interrogate some of those rationales, including this notion of fighting terrorism, eradicating poverty, and recognizing that those are not by any means any form of justification for the scale and nature of the crimes that have been occurring, of the mass detention, forced labor, discriminatory laws, high-tech manners of surveillance that are reinforcing those violations of rights. One of the things, maybe just kind of in leaving to reinforce the point that Nury made around accountability and our hope and belief that there will be a time when those committing these crimes are held responsible. Sometimes there is a misunderstanding around just what exactly crimes against humanity are. Often in our work, there is a perception by some that only genocide are crimes that merit attention from the highest of possible courts, be it the International Criminal Court, tribunals that have been stood up. It's really important to recognize that crimes against humanity alongside genocide were very much born out of the Nuremberg process coming out in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And the gravity of those crimes, the seriousness of those crimes are of such import that we don't want to further kind of perpetuate the idea that they are of lesser importance to the crime of genocide. And so our hope is that by also articulating quite clearly the crimes that are being committed, we help to also advance the effort from a legal perspective to hold perpetrators accountable, but also to urge governments to fulfill their obligation to protect vulnerable communities, and to the Chinese government to stop the commission of crimes against humanity. So we look forward to continuing to help to advance this conversation, and also urge the world to treat China in the same way that any other country who was committing crimes on this scale would be treated by the international community, and to recognize that that might touch on incredibly sensitive points for us, including our trade policy. But this is a matter of not just conscience, it's a matter of international policy, it's a matter of the future of how mass atrocity crimes are committed, and our ability as an international community to have our norms and institutions evolve to meet the evolving way in which these crimes will be committed in the future. So thank you for this opportunity, Kyle.
Thank you very much, Naomi. Very detailed analysis, and very interesting to hear the thoughts coming from the Genocide Prevention Center at the U.S. Holocaust Museum on this important case that's before us. I would now like to ask Sheng Xue. I apologize if I didn't pronounce your name properly, Xue, but I'd like to give the floor to you and have you also talk a bit about the political prisoner element of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's my pleasure to talk about this, especially in this kind of timing. 2 days later, it will be the 18 years that Dr. Wang Bingzhang was kidnapped by the Chinese government back to China from Vietnam and sentenced to life and imprisoned in solitary confinement. Dr. Wang Bingzhang came to Canada, studied in McGill University in 1979 and obtained his PhD degree in medical. And he started the Overseas Chinese Democracy movement in 1982, he was kidnapped by the CCP from Vietnam back to China in 2002 and sentenced to life. His brother, who lives in Mississauga, told me that the family in Canada has not received any information from Dr. Wang since the outbreak last December in China. And yesterday, I received the letter from Wang Li, the letter from Wang Li, who is Wang Zhang's wife. Show you Wang Zhang. Okay. This is Wang Zhang's wife, and she asked the international community to rescue his husband. And this is their 4 kids. And she asked, because she said that 10 days ago, more than 40 police officers came to her family, and more than 20 policemen guarded the door. And another 20-some police broke into the door and pressed Wang Zhang's head onto the ground. And some police also held down 4 kids and their grandma. The police wrapped Wang Zhang's head into a black bag and handcuffed him and dragged him away in front of the 4 kids. And his wife has no any information from him then. And Wang Zhang is a talented poet and a writer who refused to operate with the tyranny and also write about the truth of the pandemic. People may know that hundreds of Chinese human rights lawyers have been seriously persecuted. Many of them were tortured and given unknown drugs. However, you may don't know what will happen if you help those lawyers. A Chinese medicine Dr. Zhao and his wife fled to Canada from China last October and lives with us now. He helped and treated some of the human rights lawyers. As a result, all of his business licenses were cancelled by the government, and several
Sheng Xue, I believe we've had you freeze for a second, so we're going to ask you to try to rejoin us.
members. Am I okay now?
We can hear you now. Yes, please continue.
Yeah. So there are also Fang Bin. Can you hear me?
Sheng, you are
Can you hear me?
We're having trouble hearing you. I'm wondering if maybe maybe I can ask a few questions and we'll see if your connection becomes a little bit stronger in a few minutes. Is that okay?
I have backup. You to use my because I am using my iPad and I noticed that some problems, so I can use my cell phone to continue.
So if you want
if
to,
you can see me.
Yeah, we can hear you, but it's very choppy. So maybe we'll ask you to We can hear you now. Thank you. You still have 2 more minutes to continue.
Of deaths persecuted by the CCP can no longer be counted. The death number of Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, Falun Gong practitioners, Christians, human rights defenders, citizens who have been demolished their houses
and the farmers who have been robbed their lands, etc., have becoming ICE data. So who can tell the exact number, and who still has the patience to care about their stories and their lives? So when more than 150 Tibetans continued to call for attention from the international community with self-immolations during the past decade, and when the organs of more than 1 million Falun Gong practitioners were stolen their organ alive for 2 decades, when millions of Uighur Muslims were put in the 21st century's concentration camp, and when thousands of churches and the temple were demolished, and millions of Christians and monks were detained and tortured, and when thousands of young people in Hong Kong were brutally killed one by one in front of the whole world for a whole year, many of them were pressed by the police against their heads and their necks. There has been no large gathering demonstrations initiated by the mainstream society of democratic countries. Am I right? I wish I'm wrong. And 31 years ago, the CCP publicly used tanks and machine guns to kill thousands in Beijing and other.
Sorry, Xue, I think we're having trouble hearing you. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to start asking some questions to get a general discussion going with everyone. And hopefully we can have you connect with us in a second. So I have a general question or a comment, and then I'd like to see who could, Nury or Naomi, or Xue, if you could answer this question. There has been a lot of interest to have economic ties with China. In Western countries, in Asian countries, they see it as a great place to make money. But at the same time, we're starting to see more stories emerge about companies that are trying to set up shop in China that aren't quite aware that there are atrocities or crimes against humanity taking place there, as well as political prisoners. I'm wondering, from your perspective, what role should civil society actors be doing, as well as media, in trying to raise awareness about the dangers of economic integration with China when there are actual real cases of crimes against humanity taking place?
Should I start?
Yes, please, Nury.
Initially, when China brought into the global economic system with the help to develop their technology, education system, the world believed that China will be one of us. Obviously, that didn't happen. Instead of using that economic power, diplomatic influence to join join the democratic system or reform their political system, China has been using that very power, very influence for political repression. Not only that, the slavery is brought back by the Chinese authorities as part of the effort to engage in this human engineering that has been described by policy experts, China observers. With that, China effectively polluted the global economic system, supply chain. The United States government has done several significant things since the forced labor issue come to surface, including banning certain products, certain companies, including to add the China's entities to Commerce Department's entity list. So the business as usual cannot continue. It's past time for action. The individuals working for these global companies, especially in the technology sector, need to speak out. They need to take a position, and they need to use their position to pressure those companies, either wittingly or unwittingly aiding the Chinese state to not only build the current the surveillance state and political repression apparatus, but also need to find a way to stop it. At the end of the day, Chinese government pays attention to where their interest lies. One, their global image, the global calling them out for their repressive policies and ghastly human rights abuses is one way to do it. And then the second is that we need to look into their economic interest, as the way that the current administration, the US government, has done with a number of executive decisions that we have been seeing since last year.
Thank you, Nury. Very fascinating. Would anyone else like to comment on this?
I'll just quickly, jump in, Kyle. I think you raise a really important question. It's 2020. Our ability to understand the interconnectedness of our economic system with countries where gross human rights violations are occurring is incredibly sophisticated at this point. And I really commend the organizations that have been documenting the supply chain issues that pertain to the production of an array of material in Xinjiang. It's humbling when you think that, a large percentage of the world's cotton, a lot of the material that we are wearing every single day is produced in Xinjiang. When you look at the pressure that some of the corporations have come under, Nury talked about how recent US action has attempted to restrict the ability of some of those entities to both receive assistance but also do business in the US with a greater scrutiny. It's also important to look at the implicit impact that greater scrutiny from civil society, as you noted, and the media has on how large corporations are doing some of their business. Just today, in the last few hours, the Wall Street Journal published an article about the CEO of Volkswagen. And he's been, his role has been changed and somewhat demoted. And they note that one of his perceived leadership failings was that when Volkswagen came under scrutiny for the existence of a production plant in Xinjiang, his answer was that he was not aware of the human rights violations that were happening in Xinjiang, which led to a massive global outcry and considerable additional scrutiny and attention on Volkswagen, and has had some of the impact of forcing other companies to be more transparent about what they're doing in not just Xinjiang, but in China, some to evaluate and pull out and change some of their production behaviors. And it's also had an impact in shaping how some consumers think about how they would like to have their funds used. And in some ways, when we're faced with the reality of a government that is protected in a manner through the Security Council, through its status as a peace treaty, and whereby the economic ties, including through the Belt and Road Initiative, are just so strong and pervasive, which helps to prevent any real sustained and coordinated international action against them. In those spaces, it is what we tend to think of as being kind of track to and other forums where change happens and where it is kind of necessitated. Governments have an important role to play, and I think we've seen some interesting innovation in that in terms of especially looking at dual-use technology and research and design that's undertaken in the West and the kind of interplay with China. But I do think this is a moment where we have to be incredibly creative as a kind of international civil society to think about other avenues to increase the pressure on China in a way in which they'll feel it and ideally be compelled to change behavior. Of course, that's one of many strategies that need to be taken, but I would argue, given the uniqueness of China's status and power, and how it yields it in a way that silences some of the traditional actors, i.e. states, behavior, we need to really be thinking in a much more creative way about how to engage.
Thank you, Naomi. Xue, let's hope you have a good connection. Would you like to make a comment on the economic connections of Western countries or Asian countries with China and the disregard for human rights concerns? Xue, can you hear me? Would you like to make a comment about this issue?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I need 1 more minute to finish.
Please go ahead.
I don't know if I am attacked because I prepared for 2 equipment, but both are not working well.
It could be possible that someone is trying to, it's possible maybe that some external force is trying to go after your internet access. We don't know, but please, the floor is yours. You can finish your statement.
I don't know what I can do, but since it's okay now, I want to finish. Yeah, China, 1.4 billion people have not become free people, but have more become slaves and weapons of the CCP, and there are such Chinese people all over the world now. And during the pandemic, these people played a big role in lighting the world to the power of CCP. And when CCP copied the outer shell of democracy and stolen our and
Sorry, Xue, we are not able to hear you. I'm not sure if it's a technical issue or something more serious. So I'm going to turn to the other panelists, and hopefully you will be able to rejoin us in a second. So despite those challenges, I would like to ask another question. We were talking about interesting ways to pressure China to stop persecuting the Uyghurs, to stop imprisoning dissidents or those calling for democracy. I saw something quite interesting a few weeks ago. Lawyers for Uighur Rights, an initiative in London, England, they actually signed an open letter to the Prime Minister providing evidence that Huawei, the giant telecommunications firm, doing surveillance of Uyghur Muslims in China, and was also was lying about its role, and they're trying to get into different Western business companies. I'm wondering if anyone can say anything about that, if that's an issue that we need to explore more or do more research. Would anybody like to comment about that?
I mean, I have to say it's not an issue that we've dealt with squarely and looked at. I think you're speaking to, though, a broader challenge, and this is where that question of what do the future of mass atrocities and the commission of mass atrocities look like, and the tools and technologies that are used to repress populations, and how we often are confronted by entities that are producing and using materials that have kind of dual uses to them, which are hard to then prevent their development of, but also, you know, are being exported and can be used for different reasons by different governments, which I think is just, again, an area that we are beginning to grapple with, and there are really great researchers and also governments committed to exploring this. but it is very much, when we think of the creation of the international order and the tools that were established to protect human rights and prevent crimes on the scale of what we're looking at, they're not part of our traditional toolbox, and really does require us to kind of go back to core basics and commit to trying to innovate, because perpetrators are often able to innovate at a much faster pace than we're able to keep up.
Yeah. Thank you, Naomi. I think that's true. We got to look at these new tools among us and look at other ways where we could put pressure. And there are definitely some interesting civil society groups and human rights activists that are out there. I'd like to ask Nury a question. Nury, you wrote, just published, I think yesterday or the day before, a pretty interesting essay in I believe it was Time magazine or Newsweek. Pardon me if I got the video wrong, but you talked about the implication of the Uighur Human Rights Act, something that just passed by the U.S. Congress. Tell us a bit more about your essay and why this new legislation is so important.
It's a historic turn of events that is happening in the United States. For the first time in Uyghurs' human history, more modern, ancient, a legislative body deliberated and put in place a legislative mandate protecting Uyghurs' political, economic, social interests. And also, this is the first time a legislative body putting in place a legislation or bill to protect their own expat community, such as the Uyghur community here. And this is the first time that an agency, intelligence agency that oversee the intelligence community in the United States is being asked to monitor refugee refoulement and also forced labor issue. So when you look at the substance and historic aspect and personal aspect, this is something that will hopefully will make a difference in Uyghurs' lives, both inside and outside of China. This bill has been in the works for quite a long time. I would say at least a year and a half. And this bill has received bipartisan, bicameral support. 100 senators voted unanimously in favor of this bill. 413 members of Congress voted in favor of this bill. And now it's just waiting for President to sign to make it become a law. Once it's implemented, there are several things will happen. One, the Uyghur issue will become a part of the U.S.-China dialogue. The bill directs the U.S. government to update the Uyghur issue and the U.S.-China relations. And also this law directs the executive branch, the President of the United States, to implement the global Magnitsky sanction on those officials and entities who are responsible for the atrocities being committed against the Uyghur people. And this law also requires the State Department to prepare a report. So when you look at the substance, this will address the most pressing issue, the concentration camp situation, the ongoing cultural genocide against Uyghur people, the mass surveillance, diplomatic and China's misuse and abuse of its diplomatic influence to request governments to refoulement or repatriate refugees. And also, one of the most jarring things happened to the Uyghur people, particularly in this country, is the Chinese government's attempt and efforts to harass, intimidate, in some instance, trying to recruit Uyghurs as their informants to monitor, report the political activities. So I, on a personal level and on my official level, capacity, I'm grateful to the United States Congress for making this happen. And also, at the same time, I urge the Congress to pass the other two bills, particularly the one designed to address the forced labor swiftly. And in the meantime, I urge the president to sign this bill and designate China's officials and sanction them under the Global Magnitsky Act as soon as possible.
Thank you. And I think that this act that's has to go to the president to be approved. I think that's something that other members of parliament, other legislatures across the world should look at. Just as we're seeing the Magnitsky Act be adopted and used by other countries around the world, this act is something as well that other democracies could actually see if it could be useful and replicated. We had one
quick comment, Kyle. The United States is not the only country that has a similar legal tool. Mm-hmm. Canada has one, UK, other countries in Europe. Not only that has not been implemented, this should give a reason for countries like Australia and others to put in place. This is a very effective tool. We've seen the effect of this mechanism being effectively utilized. There's a precedent that we just need to expand this and become a global norm to go after human rights abusers.
Thank you for bringing it up, Nury. So I have a few people that have some questions. A few people have said if Sheng Xue, who has had trouble with internet connection, if she had a statement prepared, she can share it with us, and we're willing to put it on our website and to share it on social media so people can read her entire presentation she wanted to make. So we can all follow up with Xue later to get that from her. But another person asked a question earlier saying, what are the main differences and changes between China in 1989 and China today from a human rights perspective? And I'm wondering, Xue, if we can get your connection to work, if you can make a comment, do you think things are worse now, or have they always been the same, or are we seeing it ramping up to be much more, China is much more of a threat to human rights of its own citizens?
Yes. The human rights situation in China is much more worse than in 1989. And even though it was not good, but people were not as, I mean, the Chinese environment is more like a jungle. It's worse than a jungle, and everybody need to fight for their chance to live. And the government, of course, is thousands times corrupt, and really they are richer and they are stronger and they have technology, they have everything, but not anything towards democracy and human rights. And of course, this is the responsibility of Chinese people, but also it is the responsibility of the international community. And I strongly urge that we need to come up with the knowledge that the Chinese Communist Party is the biggest terrorist state in our time. And if we want to deal with them, we need to know that who they are, and not to deal with like a normal country, normal government. And that's why Chinese people not only very frightened in China, but outside China, like in Canada. So I couldn't have time to share my own story, but I will, ask you if you have the interest, you can search my name online and you will find out how far the Chinese can reach out to seal the dissident and how much power they can use. And especially we learned that now from so many cases, and the Chinese government now they can buy out and to influence so many democratic countries, politicians, and also from even every field, and to drive people to speak for them, to speak on behalf of them. So this is very serious, and it's already very late, and will be too late if we are not realized of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Xue. And we do have had cases, I'm sure in the US, I'm sure in Australia, in Canada, we have had cases of Chinese dissidents being targeted in Canada. We've had the Uighur Canadians that have been targeted. So it is an enormous challenge for our societies and our democracy. So we have two similar questions coming in. One is more of a comment saying we were able to put a lot of pressure on apartheid South Africa by using boycotts and sanctions and economic sanctions. And there's another person saying that maybe we need to boycott the Winter Olympics that are coming up in China. I'm wondering, does anyone think that, is this realistic? China is so powerful economically. Are countries going to try to do this? Is that a way forward? Anyone want to just jump in and think, is this possible or is it not?
I'd like to make a point. I'd like to address that. When the last Olympic was given to the Chinese, again, I'm just keep referring to the past wishful thinking of how China, what kind of China that the world would like to see. In 2008, the earlier when there was some Bush ended up going to that Olympics, so it didn't work. And the international community in the current environment has upper hand. I would like to think that one, we should try to renegotiate the agreement with previously signed with the Chinese government, that unless they close the concentration camps, at least, that U.S. athletes will not attend. U.S. government officials will not attend. Our commission has been urging the President Trump to make that publicly, make that statement publicly that U.S. officials will not attend unless the camps are closed. And also, the initial purpose of the Olympic is to promote spirit, unity, friendship. But it will be unthinkable that the athletes from all around the world go to Beijing to compete in the face of all of this political repression, persecution, concentration camp, and those ghastly human rights abuses committed against Uyghur people with a genocidal intent are happening in the background. So you can expect certain governments and entities to do this certain things your way, but we can start to act what is right on the things that we have a control over. We don't have to go to this sports event unless China's government at least do something to show to the world that they are listening. So that's the least that the international community can do.
Thank you, Nury. Naomi, did you have something to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really instructive and would be useful to take a look at the 2008 campaign, Dream for Darfur, which was undertaken specifically to try to target the Chinese government around its actions pertaining to Darfur. And there was a very creative and innovative approach that was used to target corporate sponsors to the Olympics, engage individual Olympians, as you mentioned, encourage some of them to consider whether or not they would attend and participate or not, and also find different ways to bring together in a solidarity movement survivors of genocide from around the world to lend their voice. And that was a situation where they were looking at the actions that China was having abroad in support of kind of supplying oil to the government of Sudan and elsewhere. And I think it's an interesting case to examine now, to look at in terms of impact, but also recognize that in some ways the challenge is even greater at this particular point, but it also makes it all that more important to be thinking and evaluating the very question that you raised. I am conscious that, in the midst of the terrors in Argentina during the military dictatorship, there was a kind of commission of inquiry of sorts from the Organization of American States that went in the midst of the World Cup. And as the members of the commission were touring a particular location, which was a horrific torture site, but had been essentially kind of cleaned up for the purpose of the visit, they could hear in the background, the games that were going on for the World Cup. And that in the aftermath, the survivors of torture recalled those moments whereby the world was focused on Argentina, and Argentina was striving to rehabilitate its image and legitimize its image, while its people were suffering acutely. And I think that we really have to wrestle with what the moral harm will be at this particular moment. I do think it's one that is of such a significant nature that we really do have to interrogate how you can allow for millions of people to face crimes against humanity and endure crimes against humanity as we come together to celebrate something that is supposed to mark a moment where we celebrate humankind and solidarity of people. So I think it's a really important question that you pose, and I think there's some interesting case studies that we can look at to move backwards. I think it's also one of those challenging moments where the question around the difference with Tiananmen Square and today, and even the question of the 2008 campaign and today, obviously China has learned that it should not, although even in the case of Xinjiang this has happened, mow down people in the streets. And again, that has taken place with protests in Xinjiang. And they have reverted to behind closed doors, committing large-scale crimes against humanity. The other things that have changed that would change the effectiveness of some of the strategies that you are suggesting is the efforts that China has made, especially in the last 10 decades, towards its place in the world through becoming an active and important player in UN peacekeeping, increasing its funding to the UN system, putting key officials in key positions within the United Nations, deepening the economic ties that have been discussed at length already in the kind of various conversations. That isolates itself from criticism and raises the cost significantly to some of the actors taking the type of actions that you were talking about, be them state or also non-state actors. So we really have to kind of go in with a pretty clear and sophisticated understanding of what the challenges are and recognize that we might be seeking to advance a number of different goals. I think that those goals each have merit and need to be considered and advanced. I think we also, with some humility, have to recognize that part of the argument that the Chinese government makes, especially around terrorism, feeds off of an international narrative, and a narrative that in many ways has been shaped by Western governments, including the United States, including Canada, around tackling a war on terror and restrictions of civil liberties at home. And, we have to really kind of wrestle with the contradictions then. They're vastly, in some ways, different and in other ways not. So there is an interrelatedness to some of the challenges that are kind of present here. And I think it's really important that you kind of elevated and raised those points and the point from the audience.
Thank you very much. So we're approaching the end of our session. So we're going to have to end it here. There were 3 very important questions. Maybe if those of you would like to, we are having a Twitter chat online. So if anyone after this that can ask that, of course, we don't have time to answer, but people ask questions about why isn't Western media talking more or having more articles about human rights abuses in China. There was another question about how there were some reports that Uyghurs were being forced to work in Western factories as slaves. So why isn't there more pressure on Western companies operating in Xinjiang? And there's been a last question about what can the Muslim world do to stand up for their fellow brothers and sisters of their faith who are in China? So those are 3 questions we don't have time to answer. But I want to thank all of you, Xue, Naomi, Nury. I want to thank you for joining us, and I'll ask you now to leave the stream. And because we have the other panelists on standby, and I believe Erwin Kotler is the odd man out. He's waiting for us to leave so that he can get into the stream. So thank you very much. And as a repeat, this is going to be broadcast on CPAC, the Canadian Public Affairs channel, at a later date. So you will be able to watch this again if you'd like to.